want to begin today actually by acknowledging with respect the Chorong speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Osage peoples whose historical relationship to this land continues to this day. And we don't often do the territorial acknowledgement in the seminar, but I think territory is a really fundamental element of borders and citizenship and nation states and sovereignty. So I think it's really relevant, and we might think of these things in different ways, but I think it's a really kind of crucial concept. And I think climate change really kind of problematizes how we view territory and how we view the relationship between nation states and territory. So the presentation that I'm giving today, I gave a similar version about 2 weeks ago in the Global Talk, but I was anticipating kind of a broader audience this time. So I'm trying to make it a little bit more concrete, less abstract. And I'm basically presenting a paper that is part of a collection of articles that is going in a journal that are looking at the intersections between borders, boundaries, migration, and precarity. To look at the way borders amplify or induce precarity, especially in terms of inequalities and inequities, and how kind of border surveillance and securitization creates precarity.
What's precarity?
Great question. So precarity is a condition of vulnerability. There's a lot of different...
Precarious.
Yeah, precarious.
Oh,
okay, so
okay.
That's okay? Well, I'll come back to it. Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, and so this relates to my PhD, which is on climate change and migration, but my PhD is looking much more specifically at newcomers to Canada and the role that climate change played in their migration here and kind of the responsibilities and reactions for Canada. Okay, so I'm going to, this is how I'm going to go through it. I'm going to kind of give a big picture of global migration and displacement. Sorry to Michael and Edwin, who were part of this 2 weeks ago. Talk about climate change impacts, the intersection between climate change and migration. I'm going to look at 3 case studies to look at the way climate migration plays out. And then I'm going to kind of change tack and look at the role of borders in the climate change, migration, precarity kind of concepts and the connections and the nexus between all of those. So if we look at international migration, there are the trends have been going up for a long time in terms of the absolute numbers, but in terms of the percentage of the world population, it has been stable at around 3% for a long time. So we hear about the increase in displacement and the increase in migration, but as a proportion of world population, it has actually been quite stable since after World War II. The other thing to look at is that in 2017, there's 258 million migrants. And so when I originally looked at these statistics in 2016, and there was kind of an upward tick in the percentage, and then it actually kind of has come back down, which just goes to show kind of how highly volatile migration statistics are, and they're really difficult to predict, and kind of the risks of using kind of trend lines to think what is happening. But this is all to say that also the majority of people around the world live in their country of birth, right? So we hear a lot about migration and immigration and displacement, but the majority of the world is living where they're born. I make a note here of the difference between migration and displacement. Migration includes displacement. So displacement is often thought of as forced, whereas migration could be forced or voluntary. This is the number of people under the purview of UNHCR. So we can see that the number of internally displaced people is going up. Right now, there are 68.5 million people for whom the UNHCR is essentially responsible. And in 2005, there were only 15 million people. So in the last 14 years, the number has really gone up quite significantly. And so I think that's something to kind of consider, that while migration might be staying relatively stable, displacement and people who need their rights protected by UNHCR is going up. If you look at the color breakdown, IDPs, Palestinians, refugees are those who have crossed an international border, and then asylum seekers, so people who are kind of knocking at the border who haven't already been designated as UNHCR refugees. And then if we look at kind of the role of climate change, I think one of the things to point out, first of all, is that climate change isn't agentless. So we're not in this time where the context, we're living in a world where climate change is a factor, but really humans have created climate change. So it's not this kind of independent factor that is influencing social and economic and political systems. We know that it is already changing our world, right? This is no longer kind of a future assumption. It has severe impacts on sea level rise, droughts, floods, extreme weather events, which in turn kind of impact social and political arrangements. And that with each kind of IPCC report, so the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which basically surveys all of the climate science and then summarizes it, kind of with more and more certainty with each report, they are indicating the implications of climate change. So we know that climate change is happening. We know it's going to impact these different systems, but we don't know exactly how. If we look at displacements, so these are again people forced to move. The kind of striking thing about this slide is that it changes quite significantly over time. There isn't a trend line here. There's major variability between years, and it often depends on where disasters strike. So in 2010, there was big flooding in China, India, and Pakistan, which obviously have big populations, so the number of displacements go up. But the other thing to note is that the number of people who are displaced by disasters is much higher than those who are displaced by conflict and violence. So the other thing to note here is that climate disasters kind of occur at the intersection of hazard and vulnerability. So if a disaster strikes somewhere that's not vulnerable, it's much less likely to become a disaster, right? Because there's resilience built into the community to respond. Yeah?
What's IDMC?
The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. So this is it's I think it's arm's length from UN. It's under the International Office for Migration, or the Organization for International Organization for Migration. But they do each year they do an annual report on kind of the movement of people from conflict and from displacement.
So International Displacement
Monitoring Center.
Thank you.
Yeah. So again, there is, these crises or these disasters are historical, they're social, they're political, economic products, right? They are a result of a climate hazard occurring in a place that doesn't have the ability to kind of respond. And then if we kind of break down those numbers for 2017, we see on the right, on the blue, these are the disasters. On the left is conflict. I want to focus on the right. We see that there were almost 19 million new displacements from disasters. About 800,000 of those are from earthquakes, so not related to weather or climate. And one of the kind of innovations in 2017 was that they started tracking droughts. So droughts are slow onset climatic events, whereas the other kind of events here that are weather related, floods, storms, hurricanes, etc., these are kind of sudden onset. They happen in an acute amount of time, and it's much easier to kind of, or not easier, but it's more perhaps direct the link between the event and the displacement, whereas droughts occur over a much longer period of time. So when we look at kind of the definition of climate-induced migration, the IOM has come up with a definition. that is used kind of as a working definition, because one of the things that we have found is that it's actually really difficult to identify people who are displaced by climate change. And the other thing to note here is that they very explicitly use the word environmental. They're not using the term climate migrants. And they do that because often the climate, as we will see in a minute, the climate kind of intersects with a whole bunch of other factors that drive migration, one of which is already the environmental conditions on the ground. And it's very difficult to make a link between climate and the environment, or, for example, how do we know that climate change really caused a particular event and not another? But what we know is that, climate change is making extreme weather events more frequent and more severe. Yeah.
How do they differentiate or account for people who have permanently transferred and who have temporarily transferred?
Uh-huh.
How do they do that?
They don't. I mean, insofar as a community or a household kind of lives through an event and there is the option to go back, that is one instance, whereas in other cases there might be a community that's entirely destroyed that there's no possible of returning to, right? So in the first instance, there's a chance that people might be displaced temporarily, but they might go back and they don't know when. But there's no way, because kind of migration decisions are driven by individual motivations in intersecting with other factors. It's really difficult to use this definition. And part of my kind of claim here is that we actually don't really know who environmental migrants or climate migrants are in a lot of circumstances, because they are people who have maybe chosen to leave because of changing agricultural or drought patterns. They've moved from a rural location to a city, and then maybe they've tried to migrate internationally. But their climate migrants are part of kind of flows of migrants around the world that we don't necessarily identify as climate migrants. We just identify them as economic migrants or migrants who are in search of a better job or life or whatever. So the definitional issue within climate change and migration has been a huge source of debate and conflict between scholars and between policymakers and experts, because for policymakers, they really need a definition that they can hang on to so they know what they're dealing with, whereas it is really difficult to have that definition and be able to identify those people. For my purposes, I like to keep the term climate because I'm trying to make a political claim that climate change is displacing people. And I think that when we drop climate from the definition, we lose kind of the political and responsibility of countries that have been causing climate change. So, this is both a deliberate and kind of a political move on my part to keep the term climate in this paper. Although, admittedly, the literature is moving away from climate migrants and using the term environmentally displaced migration.
I don't know whether this is relevant or not.
Mm-hmm.
In India right now, for the last couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
a big issue is arisen in the agriculture field. And the issue is that famines and droughts are happening more regularly, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I've not studied the
Mm-hmm.
problem
Mm-hmm.
of depth. I'm talking in terms of the news and what I understand. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of farmers are committing suicides. So there's no way to migrate, because India is in such it's a landlocked country, and they cannot migrate. So I don't know how this would in any way fit in, first of all, whether it's a climate change issue or a weather issue. But that is also something which is happening in India, for example. Hundreds of thousands of people are committing suicide, and this is a big issue right now in the country.
Yeah. Well, I think, just quickly on that, I think part of the reality of this phenomenon is how desperate people are when they don't have control over their livelihoods or their way of life or whatever, right? And so even when people, committing suicide is kind of the extreme version of feeling like you have no choice or you're so desperate. Whereas even those who are moving are often leaving really desperate kind of circumstances. I mean, I think it's fair to say that most people would prefer to be in the place where they're from, right? We have a connection to land, we have a connection to space and culture. And so none of this is necessarily a positive. I mean, migrating or moving is no better an option than staying, you know, in terms of like a judgment value kind of statement. Okay, so what do we know in terms of what the research is telling us about climate-induced migration? First of all, people have always migrated, right? This is a long-standing human, all species kind of response to changing environmental conditions. We know that the context matters. So a lot of the early literature was trying to draw a direct link from climate change to migration. And we know that that's not how migration works, right? It's really complex. The context matters. It's contextual, it's individual, and it's multi-causal. So the climate is basically intersecting with a bunch of other factors to influence migration decisions. Migration decisions also occur on a continuum. So between forced and voluntary, slow or sudden, reactive, proactive, temporary, or long-term. The other thing is that climate refugees is a legal misnomer because the term refugee has a very specific definition in international law. So just as you're asking, you know, how do we know, or, you know, that's part of the issue of policymakers of let's define this so we know who we're dealing with. And from my perspective, using the term refugee doesn't give us any extra purchase on this issue that would be useful, because the term refugees have very specific protection under international law, and the UNHCR, who is responsible for refugees now, does not even have the capacity to deal with the 68.5 million that are currently under its purview. So if we opened up the definition to include people displaced by climate change, I mean, the numbers would be entirely unmanageable. So from a purely practical point of view, I don't think it's a good idea. And then in terms of people who are doing kind of empirical work on this, we know that the majority of climate migration is happening within the global south, right? So this is not people moving from south to north. The majority of it is within countries, within regions, within borders, so rural to urban migration. So exactly, the farmers are losing their crops, and they move to a city to kind of search for another way of life. It's often temporary, right? So a lot of the displacement is from sudden onset events, and so people move away and then they come back, or people move based on seasons. So in Bangladesh, they move out of the floodplain when it's flood season, and then they move back at other times. It's based on networks, so people often go where their friends, family, other people from their community have gone. When people interview migrants, they very rarely locate climate as a direct factor. They cite it as maybe an indirect factor, often through agriculture patterns or changing water access or food security. And so, and the final point here is that it's not across borders, right? So even though this is a seminar in our Borders series, the majority of this migration is not happening internationally or across the border. My kind of question is, what does it mean when it does? One of kind of the key thinkers on this is Robert McLemmon, who's a Canadian, and he makes the case that he emphasizes kind of the relationship between adaptation and migration in the face of vulnerability and climate variability, and that migration is a result or a function of the exposure to a climatic stimulus, so kind of the severity of the hazard or the strength of the event, and the sensitivity of the population to the stimulus. So again, kind of an issue of vulnerability, socioeconomic, political, historical, and cultural factors play into determining a community or a person's vulnerability or sensitivity, and that adaptation occurs when other options other adaptation options aren't available. So if we look at a very kind of complex causal pathway of climate-induced migration, adaptation can happen at various levels. So at the national level, at the community level, or at the household level. And when a climate stimuli occurs, there's these various levels. And then there's certain kind of mechanisms that it works through. So in some cases, out-migration is the only option. So going back to your original question of, how do we know if it's temporary or permanent? In some instances, people have to leave. There's no other option but to leave. In some instances, migration is an option, but it's maybe preferred. So then people migrate out of their household or community. In other instances, migration is a viable option, but maybe they don't have the capacity to move, right? So they don't have the resources or ability, whatever, they basically have no ability to move. And then in another instance, the event happens, but migration is not even an option. So there's both kind of a decision-making process that could lead either way to out-migration or to staying, or there is kind of a capacity or lack of capacity issue where people just don't have the option but to move. Okay, so I want to go through kind of 3 case studies in the way that this works quite differently. And I'm going to start with the drought in Syria. So have you guys heard that there was a drought before? Have you heard kind of rumors or discussions about the drought linked to conflict in Syria? Yeah. Okay, so this drought is kind of the example of a slow onset climatic stimuli. And these slow onset events provide the opportunity for a community or a nation or household to respond, right? The other examples won't necessarily. So in 2006 to 2011, the northeast of Syria, which is kind of contains 2/3 of the country's yield or crop yields, was decimated by drought. And in 2007 and 2008, it was the worst in the last 2,000 years. And one of the kind of innovations in climatic science has shown us that previously, when looking at droughts or drought patterns or regular climate variability, in the last 100 years, they kind of use instrumental methods. And so they look to see whether or not the drought is kind of outside the range or within the range. And what they've been able to do through the analysis of tree rings is go back. So within the last 100 years, they have kind of observable record. Before that, they went to journals and kind of more documents of historical documents. But with these tree rings, they can see the precipitation patterns going back 2,000 years. And so they can quite clearly indicate that this drought was way outside the natural variability for as long as they can go back. To make the point that this is not a regular pattern. So Syria is like often going through droughts. I think they've had 25 years of drought in the last, since the 60s. So drought is a very common occurrence. But what's been happening is that these droughts are getting way outside the natural variability to say this is human cause, this is climate change, this is not our regular pattern. So the result was a collapse in crop yields, agricultural production. The other thing is that, again, the climate change is not happening in a vortex, right? It's not this, there are decisions that can be made to mitigate or to build resilience to climate change. And the government policies during these droughts and leading up to these droughts exacerbated the issue. So they had increased the agricultural production of water-intensive crops. They had consolidated or divided land plots into smaller plots where it's harder to manage kind of water across the same amount of space. They'd overused water. They'd changed to a different irrigation system. And so the government policies quite directly influenced the country's ability to be resilient to this drought. The result was loss of livelihoods, kids out of school, and 1.5 million Syrians moved to urban centers, right? So before the drought occurred, so if you are looking at this, so in, sorry, 1.5 million people moved to urban areas between the drought, so 2007 and 2010, 2011. And in 2002, there were maybe about 9 million people in urban areas, and there were almost 14 million in 2010. So there was a massive increase in the urban population, people moving from rural areas, which obviously puts a strain on scarce resources. But the point is that the conflict happened after there had been this huge displacement of people from the drought. As Ben and Michael know, I'm not about to make the claim that the drought caused the conflict, but certainly the drought displaced a massive amount of Syrians from rural locations to urban cities. Okay, another example of kind of climate displacement or climate migration that happens on more of a sudden onset scale or time frame is the 2017, Hurricane Maria, which struck Puerto Rico, but the entire hurricane season of 2017 was very severe. So you will recall the Harvey was the big flood in Houston, Irma hit Florida and Barbuda, where basically the entire island of Barbuda was evacuated to Puerto Rico, and then people were living in settlement centers in Puerto Rico when Maria hit. So this was kind of an ongoing several months of kind of destruction in the Caribbean. And one thing to note is that since 1981, the maximum wind speed of the most powerful hurricanes has risen dramatically. So as oceans get warmer, they provide more energy for storms. So the way hurricanes function is they suck the heat out of the ocean, and then that gives them kind of the energy for their intensity. Of course, we know that rising ocean temperatures is related to climate change. And so this case of the 2017 hurricane season really, I think, puts into perspective the increasing intensity of hurricanes related to ocean warming. And, what scientists say is that we need hurricanes to release the energy from the ocean. This is part of the natural kind of cycle. But the issue is that the intensity or the energy within the hurricanes is becoming much, much higher. So I'm going to skip this clip. I have a clip of a video, but I'm just going to skip it to keep moving. Okay, and then the last kind of case study that I just want to go through before turning to borders is Kiribati. So Kiribati is a group of low-lying island states. So we often hear about low-lying island states and climate change because of sea level rise. And because from a kind of international law or international territorial perspective, the absence or the loss of land raises all sorts of interesting questions around citizenship and sovereignty and the existence of a nation if their territory is no longer there. So it's a series of atolls, which are kind of long, kind of reef-like islands with very little that are very low lying. So I think the average is like 1.5 meters above sea level. So not only does the impact or the rise of ocean waters and king tides kind of shrink land area and water systems, it has huge impacts on the food systems, on drinking water availability, and that, what is driving the sea level rise has absolutely nothing to do with the way the people of Kiribati live their life, right? This is determined by factors in climate change that is driven by actors far from Kiribati. And furthermore, kind of the responses to it are also determined by the ability of global leaders or nation states to make decisions about reducing or curbing emissions, which is driving climate change, and they have very little kind of agency or ability to do something about it. A really interesting, the former president, Anote Tong, bought land in Fiji to provide space for people to move to. So he purchased, I think, for $8 million or something, a parcel of land in Fiji, which is a really kind of interesting way of thinking about when people are displaced from their country, where are they going to go if that country ceased to exist? And what are their rights in terms of citizenship or identity when they're occupying a land that is not necessarily theirs? The other thing is that what is happening in these low-lying island states is often people are moving to the more populated or densely populated islands. So they're moving from the kind of the more remote spaces to the areas around the capital. So Tarawa has had a massive kind of increase in population density from 2005 until 2017, I think those statistics are from. But the other thing is that it has a very high population rate, or birth rate. So not only is the population increasing quite significantly, people are also moving to spaces that are already quite dense. So the other interesting thing about Kiribati and these low-lying island states in the Pacific is that the residents there are quite explicit about their desire to not be categorized as refugees, and that they are not interested in kind of treating the symptom or treating the result of displacement, but rather want the focus to be on climate change, the fossil fuel industry, those that are causing climate change, and kind of the responsibility in the global north to take steps to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So they reject this idea of being called refugees. They don't want this kind of, they don't want to address the displacement. They want to address the cause of the displacement. Okay, so turning to kind of climate change and borders. I want to make kind of two main arguments around climate change and borders. One is the way in which I think there is kind of the intersection of borders, nations, territory, sovereignty kind of contribute to the causes of climate change, and then the way they also prevent our ability to deal with climate change. So, I mean, as a concept in international relations, we know that borders are very closely tied to states, territory, sovereignty, and that the world, like geopolitically, is divided up into these political units, this nation-state system where sovereignty exists over bounded territory, but that climate change is quite inherently a world systems problem, right? So these systems or the levels of division are incongruent between the way the world is divided and the way in which climate change affects places. The other thing is that the way states function is they basically divide up the world into, or borders divide the world into spaces where we can exploit resources, people, and the earth to different degrees, and where borders kind of create pools of exploitable labor and resources where the rules of extraction are different. So you can move from territory to territory or across borders to seek extraction or advantage from different laws or rules about extraction on that territory. Yep.
So as you've gone about studying this issue about how climate change is impacting such low-lying islands, have you come across do you think that these countries, which are at great and immediate risk of going under, anyone is bothered or taking care of their interests or taking note of their interests other than collecting data? What does your study indicate? With Kiribati, for example, is anyone bothered? They are bravely they put up that
Yeah, yeah.
But is anyone else in the world bothered? On a institutional level,
Yeah.
Forget Trump and guys. Anyone else?
Yeah. I think so. there are a group of South Pacific islands that are coming together, kind of unifying, rallying around this idea that they're not responsible, they're suffering the consequences, the global community needs to do something about it. So they have a voice that, and they're quite loud at the UNFCCC meeting, so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where states meet to talk about climate change. But the other thing is that New Zealand proposed to have a special category of migrants for countries for the low-lying South Pacific islands. New Zealand did. And it was proposed and it didn't go anywhere, but they have a special category for people from Tuvalu, which is another low-lying South Pacific island, where 75, I mean, it's not a big country, but 75 people a year can come in under this category. But certainly New Zealand, much less Australia, but New Zealand is being quite progressive in how they think about this, even though they're way far, I mean, if we go back, they're quite far removed from these islands, right? They have no real interest, I guess, or gain from this. But the other thing is that what a lot of these low-lying islands are doing is, instead of thinking about, so they are investing money in training their people so that they are employable to go elsewhere, right? Because a lot of these nations exist or persist on subsistence fishing or living, or, you know, their education levels are low, demonstrated by the very high birth rate. But they are specifically investing in people's capacity to contribute to the economy of New Zealand or Australia. So, I mean, no, people aren't really doing, if people were doing something about it, they would be trying to reduce their emissions or lessen the impacts of climate change. But as of right now, no. Other than New Zealand, who's been thinking about it, and I mean, their president is, or their prime minister that we've just seen, is quite progressive. But no, not really. Okay, so, so basically, my argument here is that kind of nation states and borders, or the reliance on borders as kind of this trope in nation state construction and political interest, which drives economic system, advances this idea that national interest, which we've heard from Trudeau around the pipelines, national interest is based on kind of economic interest and this ties of kind of economy over the environment. And I think borders and our idea of nationality and identity kind of play into that trope. Okay, so sorry, I'll go back. So are you familiar with this image? Do you guys know this image? This is an image where basically there's this idea that there are planetary boundaries that, if we stay within them, we are in a safe operating space for humanity. If we go beyond them, then we're not. And my point here is that these boundaries do not map on geopolitical boundaries, right? They have nothing to do with, they aren't contained within territory. They are divided into different kind of components of atmospheric levels, water, different elements, etc. But the point here is that they are quite incongruous with kind of borders, territory, and that there is, if we are thinking about what needs to be done with climate change, we cannot think at the nation state level. We need to get above borders to think of the world as a system, and that the current kind of mechanism for dealing with climate change, which is the UN system. I mean, the UN system is premised upon kind of sovereignty and national state identity. And so we are reinforcing this idea of a world system based on states, when that very notion prohibits us from kind of reaching or even dealing with climate change at a more kind of realistic level in terms of its impacts. And then making the final step that, insofar as we can't come up with solutions, climate change is displacing people, and those people are crossing borders. Okay. So, getting close. So then if we think about kind of borders and migration, I mean, we've seen border regimes over time and migration regimes kind of become increasingly restrictive. We've created new requirements for visas, for travel documents, for visa quotas. And so the international borders are kind of the point, although not necessarily in space, but borders are a place or a construct where categories are applied to bodies, where we create kind of categories of unauthorized, illegal, irregular, alien, foreign, which are all kind of the other of legal or refugee or asylum. And so that these kind of use of categories and classifications, by using them, we are inherently excluding others who don't fit into those categories. So that those who don't fit into those categories kind of become increasingly vulnerable or are denied safe access, may take other routes, which I'll get to in a minute. And that this leads us to question whether or not we need a category specifically for climate refugees. And again, I think this is not the right solution to this problem. The creation of categories it perpetuates this idea that some people are safe and other people are unsafe, and so it is perpetuating the same system and structures and functioning of the border that we see now. It's basically just creating one more avenue for people. And then, although I was criticized 2 weeks ago for kind of essentializing the border as a space or as a place, I think for some people the border really is, as a site, as a location, is still really important. So, for some people who are maybe fleeing conflict or war, the border represents this safe space where if they get to the border, they are entitled to international protection under international law. But for others, the border is very much a space of danger. And I think we have seen kind of with the increased use of walls and fences and the rhetoric around it, kind of the danger of this. So what we know is that the building of walls and fences, they affect the flows. They affect the flows in a sense that they deter people from taking certain routes. They don't necessarily reduce the number of people. And they increase the flows, which is often referred to as irregular, which is in between points of entry. So POEs is points of entry. So basically, these kind of border infrastructures are driving people to costlier routes in terms of time, lives, and money. The issue or the point came up a couple of weeks ago about kind of the increase of smugglers and the entire industry essentially around kind of border trafficking and smuggling and coyotes, et cetera. And that, there's this irony in that how the securitization of borders is actually making a lot of people less safe. So the year in 2015 was kind of a pivotal year in the European Union when we saw the building of fences on the routes in Eastern Europe. And if we look here, we can, it's difficult to see here, but we can see the red lines kind of in the Balkans in between Hungary and Austria. Were created, and basically what happened was it deterred routes around that area. So instead of going that way, it went elsewhere. The other thing that this points out is that it's not just about building actual walls, it's also the use of surveillance systems, security mechanisms, fences, drones, etc., that create a deterrence to people. So it's not just the physical walls themselves, but it's also the rhetoric around it. Yeah. So
those red lines?
The red lines are walls. Yeah.
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 it's more preventing the Middle East refugees.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what happened in Europe was there was a real mix of migrants, right? So a lot of people were coming from Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, who, if they are fleeing conflict or fear of persecution, they are entitled under international law to protection. What happens is that the flows of people into Europe, there were other people who weren't necessarily coming from the Middle East, but the majority of people were, who joined those flows and were trying to get to Europe. So the majority of people who were entering Europe, and I should have kept a slide of the different kind of nationalities, but the majority of the people were from Syria. There were Eritreans. But yeah, that route is coming from the Middle East. Okay. So what basically happened, we can't see the map, but there's a map there, is that the numbers in black are from 2015 and the numbers in blue are from 2018. So the Western Balkans route and the Eastern Land route where on the top right kind of, that number went from 764,000 in 2015 to 5,200, right? So there was a massive, massive drop. At the same time, between 2015 and 2018, there was a huge push of the EU border out beyond Europe, so into the North African states, right? So this wasn't just kind of the building of fences and deterrence along these borders, but there was kind of a much more holistic attempt to push people away from coming to Europe. But the point here is that the drop in the routes on the Western Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean has seen a major uptick in the Central Mediterranean route and in the Western Mediterranean route. So you see the Western Mediterranean route, which is going up like Morocco to Spain, went from 7,000 to 52,000. So all of the numbers come down, but the point here is kind of the redirect. And so what these borders and fences have done is basically pushed people into much higher risk routes. So if we look kind of at the deaths in the Mediterranean Sea, we heard a lot about it in the news. So we see them kind of increasing dramatically in 2016 and then coming down. But what this statistic doesn't show, or what these statistics don't show, is that when the fences were built in 2015, the number of deaths per 1,000 arrivals went way up, right? So in 2015, there were 3.7 deaths per 1,000, whereas in 2018, there were almost 20 deaths per 1,000. So this is a massive increase in the number of deaths as people are kind of driven into more dangerous and more restrictive routes. So this path is the path of a young Somali guy who was apprehended in Libya and returned to Niger. And this is kind of his depiction of his path. Where I'm from in Somalia, there was this extreme drought. People were dying and there was no work. So in 2016, I made the decision to leave. Honestly, I thought it was bad in Somalia, but the things I have seen since then on the journey here, people are being electrocuted, being tortured, people dying even. When I left, I didn't know where I would go or how I would get there. I took around $1,000 with me and paid all of it to smugglers in Libya. I went first to Yemen and took a boat for some weeks across the sea to Sudan. They took all of our luggage and threw it away. On that journey, nobody cared if you live or if you die. The boat was not even big enough to carry us all. We arrived in Sudan. Smugglers took us in a car. There was not enough space in the vehicle. They put people on top of one another, but if you complained, they would beat you. We barely ate for 2 weeks. We couldn't. Many people were sick and vomiting. 2 people even died. When we arrived to Libya, we were forced into an underground hole. So many people were sick. My good friend was so sick that he died there. You can't sleep in a hole. There were maggots all over you, eating your skin. They give you a phone to call your family to ask for money, and then they beat you and electrocute you. When I refused to call my family, they tied my hands and feet and poured water all over me and electrocuted me. they electrocute you until your whole body shakes. So I think this is a very kind of explicit example of the vulnerability and the insecurity that people feel who are forced to make these crossings. I think the other thing that's quite illustrative here is that this young man very explicitly in the interview explains that it was the drought in Somalia that forced him to leave. So from the surface, there are movements of migrants out of Africa into Europe, but we often think that they're moving there as economic migrants, which they are, but we kind of ignore the role that the climate has played in that decision to move. Okay, so bringing it kind of all together. So I think that, if we tie these case studies back from either the people in the South Pacific on the move, Syrians, or people in the Caribbean, what happens kind of at the border is the suspension of rights, an exclusion by way of classification, so that because these people aren't necessarily fitting into a category that is identifiable by the border, their rights or their citizenship rights are kind of suspended because they are in this space of exclusion. The other thing to note here is that when I'm talking about precarity, it is quite explicitly a politically induced position of vulnerability, right? So this doesn't exist on its own. There are systems and there are infrastructures at play that influence precarity, both in place, so in terms of the situation in which people are vulnerable and are forced to move in the first place because their community necessarily isn't that resilient, to their movements with smugglers or trying to get from point A to point B, and then also at the border in terms of the securitization of bordering practices and the kind of the use of detention centers or the deferral of, or the deterrence of people away from points of entry to irregular crossings. Okay, so in conclusion, I think that borders are playing have this implicit role in contributing to climate change and to preventing solutions. So basically this kind of geopolitical order that we're locked into that is premised upon border state territory sovereignty is both contributing to climate change and also inhibiting our ability to think at kind of a world system scale to address it. I think that borders are enhancing the precarity of climate migrants, both in motion and at the border, through the way in which borders construct identity, the securitization of migration, application of categories, and the use of infrastructures. So, I mean, a lot of this, borders are enhancing or amplifying precarity of all migrants, but I think specifically in terms of the lack of clear classification or identity, or the way in which borders rely on this kind of rational understanding or identifiable type of person to process them at the border, puts people who are driven or displaced by climate in kind of a more precarious situation. Thank you very much.